The year 1066 marks one of the most pivotal turning points in England's history, when King Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king, died without an heir. The throne became the prize for those bold enough to claim it. 3 contenders emerged. Harold Godwin's son, the most powerful noble in England, chosen by the Wynnegamote Council of Nobles and backed by the native aristocracy. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, who based his claim on an old treaty and Norse ambitions. William, Duke of Normandy, a distant relative of Edward, who asserted that the late king had promised him the crown. In September that year, Harold Hardrada led 10,000 Norwegian troops to land in the north. Harold Godwin's son marched rapidly and crushed the Norwegian army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. A resounding victory, but one that left his soldiers exhausted. Just 3 weeks later, Harold was forced to march 300 kilometers south to confront William, who had just landed in Sussex with a highly trained army consisting of armored cavalry, archers, and infantry, a combined force the Anglo-Saxons had never faced before. On October 14, 1066, the two armies clashed at the Battle of Hastings. The Anglo-Saxon army built a solid shield wall, resisting many charges. But William feigned retreat, luring part of Harold's forces into pursuit, breaking the formation. When Norman cavalry counterattacked, Harold was killed. Legend says he was struck by an arrow in the eye. By evening, the English forces were routed. This victory brought William to the throne, and history remembers him as William the Conqueror. He became the first Norman king of England, marking the beginning of a new era. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was almost entirely replaced by Norman lords loyal to William. A network of stone castles rose across the land to suppress and control, the most famous being the Tower of London. Language changed. The ruling class spoke Norman French, while the common people used Old English. Over time, the two merged, giving birth to Middle English, the foundation of today's English language. In 1086, William ordered the creation of the Domesday Book, a detailed inventory of all land, people, and resources, identifying precisely which peasant, which plot of land belonged to whom. It is considered the first comprehensive tax record in medieval Europe. The Norman Conquest did not only change the throne, it changed language, society, law, and culture, transforming England from an Anglo-Saxon kingdom into a part of the Norman world, tying its destiny to continental Europe for centuries to come. When William died, 1087, the throne passed to his son William II, also known as William Rufus. He was famously hot-tempered and frequently clashed with both the church and the nobility. In 1100, during a hunting expedition in the New Forest, William II died from a stray arrow, a mysterious event that many believe was more than just an accident. The throne fell into the hands of Henry I, William II's younger brother, a practical monarch. Henry issued the Charter of Liberties, promising to limit royal abuses in order to win the noble support. But tragedy struck when his only son died in the White Ship disaster, 1120. With no male heir, Henry was forced to make the nobles swear allegiance to his daughter Matilda. But upon his death, that oath was quickly broken. In 1135, the throne was disputed between Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blois. The Civil War lasted nearly 20 years and became known as the Anarchy. The entire country descended into chaos. Villages were plundered, and warlords seized controlled territories. In the end, a compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king until his death, and Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, would succeed him. In 1154, Henry II ascended the throne, founding the Plantagenet dynasty. He inherited a vast territory stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, a domain known as the Angevin Empire. Henry reformed the legal system and laid the foundation for common law, England's distinctive legal framework. However, his reign is also marked by a famous tragedy, his conflict with Archbishop Thomas Becket, which ended in Becket's assassination inside Canterbury Cathedral 1170, shocking all of Europe. After Henry II, the throne passed to his son, Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, 1189 to 1199. Richard was a great warrior, spending most of his reign abroad on crusades, rarely setting foot in England. He left behind a glorious image in battle, but also drained the country through heavy taxation, and the ransom paid after his capture in Austria, Richard's brother John, 1199 to 1216, left behind a far darker legacy. He failed against the French king, losing nearly all the ancestral territories in Normandy and Anjou. John's tyranny sparked a noble revolt, and in 1215 he was forced to sign the Magna Carta, the famous charter asserting that even the king must obey the law. The Magna Carta later became the cornerstone of liberty and the rule of law in England. John's successor was Henry III, 1216 to 1272. He ruled for over half a century, but proved to be a weak king, frequently at odds with the nobility. Eventually, under the leadership of Simon de Montfort, the nobles rebelled and forced Henry to accept a rudimentary form of parliament, 1265, where not only nobles but also representatives of townspeople could participate, the seed of the modern parliament. When Edward I ascended the throne in 1272, England had just emerged from a long period of instability under Henry III. Edward quickly proved himself to be an ambitious and decisive king. Contemporaries called him Longshanks because of his tall stature, and posterity remembers him as a hammer of the Scots, the hammer that crushed Scotland. Wales to the west had long been a proud land. The Celtic people there had never fully submitted to Rome or the Anglo-Saxons, and by the 13th century, they still maintained autonomous principalities. The strongest of these was Gwynedd, under the leadership of Llywelyn ap Griffith, who was officially recognized as Prince of Wales. To Edward, a prince existing alongside the King of England was unacceptable. Conflict quickly escalated. In 1282, he launched a full-scale campaign, mobilizing forces from across the kingdom. English troops advanced into the rugged mountains and fierce battles broke out. In one engagement, Llywelyn was killed, and his brother was captured and executed. Within just 1 year, the Welsh dream of independence collapsed. In 1284, the Statute of Rutland officially annexed Wales into the Kingdom of England, imposing English law and administrative systems. But Edward didn't rule by law alone. He ruled by stone and mortar. Along the North Welsh coast, a chain of massive castles rose: Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech, and Beaumaris. These were among the most advanced structures in Europe at the time, with high walls, strong round towers, drawbridges, and moats. They were both defensive fortresses and declarations of power. From now on, Wales belonged to England. To engrave that message further, Edward created a new tradition. The title Prince of Wales will belong only to the heir to the English throne, from his son Edward II to Prince Charles, now Charles III. This title has endured, a permanent historical mark reminding all of the conquest. If Wales was a swift victory, then Scotland became a prolonged struggle. After the death of King Alexander III, 1286, and his granddaughter Margaret, 1290, Scotland plunged into a succession crisis. More than a dozen nobles vied for crown, and Edward was invited to act as arbitrator. But the arbiter quickly became a usurper. He placed John Balliol on the throne, but in reality reduced Scotland to a vassal state. That arrogance ignited resistance. In 1296, Edward invaded Scotland directly, captured Edinburgh, and seized the Stone of Scone, the sacred coronation stone of the Scots, and took it to Westminster as spoils of war. For the Scots, it was an act of humiliation. Immediately after, a rebellion erupted under banner of a little-known nobleman, William Wallace. In September 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace and Andrew Moray used clever tactics to defeat a far larger English army. It was a major shock. For the first time, the Scots proved they could defeat Edward. Wallace became the guardian of Scotland. But Edward did not give up. In 1298, he personally led a large army to face Wallace at Falkirk. Welsh crossbowmen and English heavy cavalry crushed Wallace's long spear formations. Wallace had to retreat into the forests and mountains, becoming a symbol of guerrilla resistance. In 1305, he was betrayed, captured, brought to London, and brutally executed, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. But instead of killing Scotland's spirit, his death turned Wallace into a legend. At the same time, another figure rose, Robert the Bruce. Initially hesitant, he gradually became the supreme leader of the resistance movement, laying the foundation for the later victory at Bannockburn. Edward I died in 1307, while on his way to lead another campaign into Scotland. He left behind a powerful kingdom, with a reformed legal system, a disciplined army, and especially the stone castles in Wales, now recognized by UNESCO as World Heritage Sites. When Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, he had to inherit a vast legacy from his father. Edward I, the conqueror of Wales and the terror of Scotland. But Edward II was not his father. In contrast to the hammer of the Scots, Edward II was seen as weak, easily manipulated, and more enamored with his favorite companions than with the nation. His indecisiveness quickly handed control of the court to powerful nobles. His greatest failure came in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn. The English army, large and well-equipped, marched into Scotland to crush Robert the Bruce. But the marshy terrain, the Scots' defensive tactics using long spears, and their fierce determination led to a disastrous defeat for the English. Bannockburn was not just a military victory, but a milestone that secured Scotland's independence for many decades. Afterward, Edward II's reputation collapsed. Nobles rebelled, and Queen Isabella allied with her lover Roger Mortimer to overthrow the king himself. In 1327, Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III. Shortly after, he was imprisoned and died under tragic circumstances. Many sources claim he was assassinated in captivity. The reign of Edward II went down in history as a time of bitter failure. When Edward III ascended the throne in 1327, he was only 14 years old. In the early years, real power lay in the hands of his mother, Isabella of France, and her lover Roger Mortimer. The court was engulfed in chaos, and royal prestige was humiliated. But just a few years later, Edward III suddenly turned the tide. In 1330, he staged a palace coup, arrested Mortimer, and had him executed, while placing his mother under house arrest. From then on, Edward officially took power, beginning a mighty reign. From the start, Edward III harbored a grand ambition: the French throne, through his mother, Princess Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France. He claimed the right to inherit the crown when the Capetian line died out in 1328. However, the French nobility chose Philip VI from the House of Valois as king. Edward saw this as an insult and used it as justification to assert his claim. In 1337, he officially declared war, launching a conflict that would last over a century, the 100 Years' War. This was not just a feudal dispute over a throne, but a confrontation between two nations forming distinct national identities, and England consolidating its power around the monarchy and parliament, and a France under the Valois dynasty determined to defend its territory. In the very first decades, England achieved resounding victories that shook Europe. 1346, Battle of Crécy. The English army, vastly outnumbered, used a new tactic: the longbow, a cheap weapon with greater range and better armor-piercing ability than the crossbow. English peasant archers brought down row after row of French cavalry, the backbone of feudal warfare. This marked a historical turning point. Peasant bowmen could bring down glamorous knights. 1356, Battle of Poitiers. Under the command of Edward III's son, the Black Prince, the English again performed a miracle. They crushed the French army and captured King John II of France. Never before had France's prestige fallen so low, and never before had England reached such heights of power. For a long time, the English controlled vast territories in the west and north of France. Courts, cities, and castles flew the English flag, signaling an era in which England rose to become a continental power. Yet Edward III was not only a warrior. Domestically, he implemented important reforms that laid the groundwork for parliamentary monarchy in the future. Under his reign, the English Parliament was clearly divided into two houses: the House of Lords, nobles and clergy, and the House of Commons, representatives of townspeople and wealthy farmers. Whenever he needed money for war, Edward had to summon Parliament to request taxes. This was a historic compromise. The war in France forced the king to rely on Parliament, and from then on, Parliament gradually became a lasting political institution. The time of Edward III was also a period of flourishing culture. Magnificent Gothic architecture was constructed, reflecting royal wealth and prestige. English literature began to emerge alongside Latin and Norman French. By the late 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer, a great English poet, would write the Canterbury Tales, depicting a colorful society of monks, knights, merchants, and craftsmen. Many scholars regard Chaucer as the father of English literature, and the foundation for this achievement was the stability and prosperity under Edward III. While England stood at the height of victory in France, an invisible enemy appeared, the plague. In the summer of 1348, ships docking at Dorset brought with them a horror from the continent, a disease caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium spread by fleas on black rats. Within months, it swept across the south, then reached London and the north. Dead bodies piled up in the streets. Church bells rang constantly. No family was spared. Within 2 years, between a third and half of England's population, millions of people vanished. Entire villages were abandoned, fields overgrown with weeds. The consequences were devastating. A shortage of labor led to the collapse of agricultural production. Wages rose because the few remaining peasants became valuable. The nobility tried to tighten control, but peasants began demanding rights. They no longer accepted the bound status of serfs as before. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was a social storm, breaking the rigid feudal structure and paving the way for major upheavals in the following decades. Edward III died in 1377, leaving the throne to his grandson, Richard II, who was only 10 years old at the time. A child on the throne, in a country devastated by war with France and the aftermath of plague. Richard II's court continuously imposed taxes to sustain the war, culminating in the poll tax, a heavy levy applied even to the poor. In a post-Black Death context, where labor was scarce, this policy was like pouring fuel onto boiling oil. In 1381, England erupted in the Peasants' Revolt, led by Wat Tyler and the radical preacher John Ball. Tens of thousands of peasants from Kent and Essex marched on London. They protested not only against taxes, but also demanded the abolition of serfdom and social equality, ideas far ahead of their time. The rebels seized London, burned down noble houses, and executed hated officials. Richard II, then only 14 years old, had to confront the crowd himself at Smithfield. The tense encounter ended when Wat Tyler was killed. The movement lost its leader, and the rebels were brutally suppressed. Though it failed, the uprising left a profound mark. It showed that the old feudal order was crumbling, and that the peasant class no longer accepted their fate. In the following century, serfdom gradually disappeared in England, an indirect legacy of both the Black Death and the 1381 revolt. Richard II, though successful in crushing the rebellion, grew increasingly autocratic and out of touch. Resentment among the nobility mounted, and in 1399, he was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, ushering in a new dynasty, the House of Lancaster, with Henry IV ascending the throne. In the 15th century, England was no longer the triumphant nation. In France, it had been under Edward III. After decades of the 100 Years' War, the royal treasury was empty. The country was exhausted, and the Plantagenet dynasty deeply fractured. It was in this context that a succession crisis exploded, plunging England into a nearly 30-year civil war, later known as the Wars of the Roses. The root cause lay in the weakness of the Lancastrian line, then holding the crown. Henry VI reigned 1422 to 1461, 1470 to 1471, was a gentle but feeble king, suffering from mental illness. His court was dominated by noble factions, and the country descended into chaos. The rival was the House of York, another branch of the Plantagenet royal family, with a claim to the throne just as legitimate. Its leader was Richard, Duke of York, and later his sons, especially Edward IV. The two sides adopted different symbols, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, dividing all of England by two floral emblems. In 1455, the spark ignited at the Battle of St. Albans, a short but fierce clash between the Lancastrians under King Henry VI and the Yorkists under Duke Richard of York. The Yorkists emerged victorious, marking the beginning of a civil war that would last nearly 30 years, during which the English throne changed hands repeatedly. In the years that followed, the war continued sporadically with victories and defeats trading sides, but it reached its climax in 1461 at the Battle of Towton. This was the bloodiest battle on English soil during the Middle Ages, with tens of thousands killed in a snowstorm. As a result, the House of York triumphed. Although Richard of York had already died, his son ascended the throne with the title Edward IV. The Lancastrians were overthrown. Henry VI, already weak and mentally unstable, was deposed, and Queen Margaret of Anjou fled first to Scotland, then to France to seek aid. But the war was not yet over. Through alliances with powerful nobles, particularly the Earl of Warwick, known as a kingmaker, the Lancastrian faction unexpectedly returned in 1470, restoring Henry VI to the throne. However, this restoration was short-lived. Only a year later, Edward IV reclaimed power, culminating in a decisive confrontation at the Battle of Tewkesbury, 1471. There, the Lancastrian army was crushed. Prince Edward, son of Henry VI, was killed, and Henry VI was imprisoned in the Tower of London and died shortly after. With his death, the House of Lancaster was nearly extinguished. The Yorkist reign appeared secure, but upheaval soon returned. Edward IV ruled until 1483, when he died, leaving the throne to his young son, Edward V. But shortly thereafter, Edward's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power, deposed his two nephews, confined in the Tower of London, and they mysteriously vanished. Richard proclaimed himself king, taking the title Richard III. But the stain of the princes in the Tower, the suspicion that he had the two princes murdered, tarnished the Yorkist name, causing many nobles to turn against him. This opened the door for a new figure, Henry Tudor. Though only a distant noble of Lancastrian descent, Henry gathered a coalition of those discontented with Richard. In 1485, he returned to England and faced the king directly at the Battle of Bosworth Field. The battle was intense, but as many nobles switched sides, Richard III was surrounded and killed on the battlefield. He became the last English king to die in battle, a tragic end for the House of York. Victory belonged to Henry Tudor, who immediately ascended the throne as Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. To heal the wounds of civil war, Henry married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York into the Tudor rose. This was not only the new emblem of the dynasty, but a national statement of reconciliation after 3 decades of brutal civil war. After ending the bloody civil war known as the Wars of the Roses, Henry VII ascended the throne in 1485, founding the Tudor dynasty. He was not known for glorious battles, but left a deep impression through shrewd and steadfast policies. Henry focused on consolidating royal power, suppressing the feudal lords who had run rampant during the chaos, and centralizing authority within the royal court. He rebuilt the economy, promoted trade, established merchant guilds, and expanded relations with Europe, while ensuring long-term stability through clever diplomatic marriages, marrying his children into the royal families of Scotland and Spain to build alliances. Nearly 25 years of Henry VII's rule brought peace after disorder, and when he died in 1509, he left the throne to his eldest son, a young man who would change the course of English history in ways no one could have imagined, Henry VIII. When he came to the throne at age 18, Henry VIII was hailed by his subjects as an ideal prince. He was young, strong, skilled in sports, hunting, music, and the arts. But history does not remember him as an artist or a romantic horseman, but as a king infamous for 6 marriages and for a decision that shook all of Europe. Severing ties with Rome and founding the Church of England, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother, to strengthen ties with Spain. But after many years, Catherine bore only one daughter, Mary, while all other children died young. His obsession with a male heir grew into frustration. As his youth faded, he became infatuated with Boleyn, a young noblewoman, and was determined to divorce Catherine to marry her. However, Pope Clement VII firmly refused, especially under pressure from Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and also Catherine's nephew. Henry's ambition and fiery temper would not accept this denial. If Rome would not grant him the power, he would take it himself. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. From that moment, he was not only the head of state, but also of religion. This decision forever altered the face of England. His marriage to Anne Boleyn was legitimized, and Catherine was cast aside. Catholic monasteries across England were dissolved. Their lands, gold, and vast assets were confiscated and transferred to the crown and loyal nobles. A new elite class emerged in support of Henry, while the Pope lost all power on the island. The Church of England, Anglican Church, was born independent of the Vatican, yet retaining many Catholic rituals. With a single decree, Henry shook not just religion, but the economy and social fabric of the nation. But Henry VIII is also famous for his 6 marriages, a string of personal tragedies remembered in the popular rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Catherine of Aragon was divorced, and Boleyn, whom he once loved passionately, was executed in 1536 on charges of adultery and treason. Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife, died during childbirth, giving him a son, Edward, and of Cleves, a brief political marriage ended in divorce. Catherine Howard was executed for adultery, and finally, Catherine Parr, his 6th wife, survived him. These marriages were not just matters of the heart, but political and religious calculations that changed the kingdom's fate. In government, Henry ruled with an iron hand. Anyone who opposed a break with Rome faced execution, including close friends. Thomas More, scholar and former chancellor, refused to swear loyalty to the king as head of the church, and paid with his life. Under his rule, England became deeply divided. Catholics clashed with Anglicans, and the flames of religious conflict were lit. Fires that would burn for centuries. Though marked by controversy and bloodshed, Henry VIII changed England forever. He concentrated royal power more than any king before him, filled the treasury with church wealth, and most importantly, forged a new national identity, no longer dependent on Rome, but politically and religiously independent entity. When he died in 1547, England was stronger, wealthier, but also more divided. His 3 children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, would continue to struggle for power, and in doing so, reshape the religious future and identity of the nation. After the death of Henry VIII, the throne passed to his only son with Jane Seymour, Edward VI. At the time, Edward was only 9 years old, too young to rule directly, so real power rested in the hands of the Regency Council, first led by the king's uncle, Edward Seymour, and later by John Dudley, under the name of the young monarch. England entered a period of religious reform more radical than ever before. All traces of papal authority were completely erased, and the symbols and rituals of Catholicism were gradually dismantled. Notably, in 1549, the Book of Common Prayer was introduced, for the first time bringing the English language into worship, replacing the ancient Latin. It marked a turning point confirming that England had now become a clearly Protestant nation. Yet Edward had been frail since birth, and he died in 1553, aged only 15, leaving the throne in a precarious state. His successor was Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. A devout Catholic, Mary immediately sought to reverse everything her father and half-brother had done. She returned England to papal authority, restored Catholicism, and launched a brutal campaign of persecution against Protestants. More than 280 people were burned at the stake for heresy, earning her the enduring nickname Bloody Mary. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain further fueled public resentment. The English feared the country would fall under control of a powerful foreign Catholic monarchy. But Mary's reign was short and filled with failure. She died in 1558 without an heir, and once again the throne changed hands. This time, it went to Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, England had endured 3 decades of intense religious upheaval and division between Catholics and Protestants. The Queen chose a path of religious compromise. In 1559, she enacted the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity, reaffirming that the monarch was the head of the Church of England, while also establishing a uniform religious practice. This policy, known as the Elizabethan Settlement, became the foundation that allowed Anglicanism to stabilize and remain closely tied to England's national identity to this day. In foreign affairs, Elizabeth transformed England from a position of weakness into a formidable naval power. The peak came in 1588, when the Spanish Armada, the most powerful fleet in Europe at the time, invaded but was decisively defeated by the English Navy. This victory not only protected the nation, but also asserted England's new position on the international stage. In addition, Elizabeth supported both overseas expeditions. Francis Drake became the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, while Walter Raleigh expanded the route to the New World. In politics and naval affairs, Elizabeth stood as a resilient monarch, but in culture, she ushered in a golden age. Under her reign, English literature and the arts flourished. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and many other talents turned the London stage into a creative epicenter of Europe. The spirit of the Renaissance spread widely, making England a power not only in might, but also in culture. Elizabeth chose to remain unmarried for life, leaving behind the image of the Virgin Queen, a monarch wedded only to the throne and the nation. In 1603, the death of Elizabeth I marked the end of the illustrious Tudor dynasty and ushered England into a new era. She died without a direct heir, and the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, great-grandson of Henry VII. From then on, James became James I of England, initiating the union of the crowns, where the kingdoms of England and Scotland shared one monarch, yet maintained separate laws, parliaments, and churches. One king, two thrones, two nations, and the beginning of new tensions. James I believed his authority came directly from God, subject to no earthly limits. This doctrine of the divine right of kings brought him into constant conflict with the English Parliament, which increasingly asserted its role as the voice of the people, especially on matters of taxation. In religious affairs, he walked a fine line between Anglican Catholics and Puritans. Amidst this tension, in 1604, he convened the Hampton Court Conference, rejecting many Puritan demands, but agreeing to commission a new English translation of the Bible. The result was the King James Bible of 1611, a literary masterpiece whose influence would far exceed expectations, becoming an enduring cultural milestone for the English-speaking world. But James's reign was also overshadowed by plots. On the night of November 5th, 1605, a group of radical Catholics hid gunpowder in the basement of the House of Commons, planning to blow up Parliament and kill both the king and the MPs. The plot was discovered. Guy Fawkes was captured, and England was forever imprinted with the fear of Catholic threats. To this day, the British people still burn effigies of Guy Fawkes each bonfire night, a symbol of failed betrayal. James died in 1625, leaving the throne to his son, Charles I, who inherited his father's ambition for power but lacked political finesse. Right from the start, Charles stirred public unease by marrying Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, alarming his Anglican subjects. He further alienated the people by relying on Archbishop Laud, who pushed for rituals in the church that resembled Catholic practices, enraging the Puritans. But above all loomed the issue of money. Charles needed funds for war. Parliament refused, so he resolved to rule without them. From 1629 to 1640, for 11 consecutive years, Charles I shut down Parliament and ruled alone, a period later known as 11 years' tyranny. He sought funds through all means, including imposing the ship money tax, even on inland counties without ports. But when he tried to enforce a new prayer book in Scotland, the Scots rebelled, igniting the bishops' wars. Lacking money to continue the war, Charles was forced to recall Parliament. But instead of submission, Parliament fought back fiercely. The short Parliament in 1640 was swiftly dissolved, followed by the Long Parliament, which issued the Grand Remonstrance, a sweeping list of grievances against King. Trust between King and Parliament collapsed entirely. In 1642, Charles made a catastrophic mistake. He personally led troops into the House of Commons to arrest 5 opposing members of Parliament. The plot failed, and this marked the point of no return. England descended into civil war. Supporters of the king, the royalists, or cavaliers, faced off against the supporters of Parliament, known as parliamentarians or Roundheads. At first, the conflict was deadlocked, but the parliamentary side soon gained the upper hand thanks to Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan MP who formed the disciplined and formidable Ironsides cavalry. Together with the new model army led by Fairfax, Cromwell secured major victories at Marston Moor in 1644 and Naseby in 1645, crushing the royalist forces. Charles was captured, but continued to negotiate in secret, even forming an alliance with Scotland in hopes of returning to the battlefield. This betrayal exhausted Parliament's patience. In 1648, Cromwell ordered troops into the Commons and purged moderate MPs in what became known as Pride's Purge, leaving only to run Parliament, a body willing to put the king on trial. In January 1649, Charles I was brought to court, charged with treason against the nation. He stood in the dock and defiantly declared that a king could not be judged by his subjects. But the era had changed. Parliament and the army no longer accepted the idea of absolute monarchy. On January 30th, 1649, at Whitehall, Charles I walked to the scaffold, held his head high and prayed. Just before the axe fell, the crowd stood in stunned silence. For the first time in history, a legitimate English monarch had been publicly executed. The death of Charles I was not just a fall of man. It was a collapse of the illusion of divine kingship. For the first time in its history, England became a republic, the Commonwealth, under the iron rule of Oliver Cromwell. And from that moment on, the question of who truly rules England, the monarch or parliament, became the central thread of modern British politics. In its early years, the Commonwealth faced resistance on all fronts. The Irish rose up and Cromwell responded with a brutal campaign, 1649 to 1650, that unleashed terror in Drogheda and Wexford, events still etched in Irish memory. In Scotland, royalists declared Charles II, son of the executed king, to be the rightful monarch. But Cromwell marched north, defeating the Scots at Dunbar, 1650, and Worcester, 1651, forcing Charles II to flee to the continent. By 1653, Cromwell was no longer merely a general. Parliament was divided and impotent. Cromwell dissolved it by force and was proclaimed Lord Protector, ruler of England, Scotland, and Ireland. In name, England remained a republic, but in practice, Cromwell ruled as a king without a crown. He established a strict Puritan regime, imposing rigid moral codes. Taverns were shut, theaters banned, and even Christmas celebrations were subdued. Yet he also built a disciplined state, expanded the Royal Navy, and elevated England's maritime power in wars against the Dutch Republic. Cromwell died in 1658. His son, Richard, lacked both political acumen and military prestige to hold the office of Lord Protector. The Republic quickly unraveled, and the English people, weary of years under Puritan rule, began longing for the return of the monarchy. In 1660, the opportunity arose. The army and Parliament invited Charles II, son of Charles I, back from exile. The restoration of the monarchy was celebrated with joy, and a new era began. Charles II embodied the opposite Cromwell. He enjoyed parties, theater, and music, earning him the nickname Merry Monarch. London buzzed again with theaters, drinking, and festivities. But his reign wasn't all mirth. In 1665, the Great Plague struck, killing nearly a quarter of London's population before the city could recover. In 1666, the Great Fire of London devastated most of the capital, leaving only scorched stone walls. Despite these calamities, Charles II managed to hold on to his throne, partly because he maintained a delicate balance between royal power and Parliament, never repeating the fatal overreach of his father. After the death of Charles II in 1685, the throne passed his brother, James II. But unlike his brother, James was a devout Catholic, ruling a country where the majority were staunchly Anglican. He appointed Catholics to high office, promoted religious freedom for his co-religionists, and sought to expand the absolute power of the monarchy. His policies sparked widespread discontent among both the nobility and commoners. To many, James II became a threat. England risked falling under Rome's control, and absolute rule seemed poised to return. In 1688, tensions reached a boiling point when James had a Catholic son, raising the specter of a lasting Catholic dynasty. A group of English nobles and MPs secretly sent an invitation to William of Orange, ruler of the Netherlands and husband of Mary, James's Anglican daughter, urging him to intervene. William answered the call, landing his forces on England's shores. Instead of resisting, James found himself isolated, abandoned both militarily and politically. He fled to France, and the upheaval became known as the Glorious Revolution. Almost bloodless, yet a transformation that forever altered England's political landscape. In 1689, William and Mary were recognized by Parliament as co-monarchs. But more importantly, they had to sign the Bill of Rights, a document that laid down the fundamental principle. From now on, Parliament would hold supreme authority. The monarch could no longer rule by decree, impose taxes, or maintain a standing army without parliamentary consent. This marked the birth of a constitutional monarchy, where the king or queen's power would be bound by law and parliament. In just 4 decades, England had gone from executing a king, experimenting with a republic, restoring monarchy, and finally establishing a new political system, one that would influence the entire Western world in the centuries to come.